right, welcome. Imagine, if you will, you're driving down a gravel road. There's a plume of dust shooting up behind you. You see fields of green all around you. You approach a hill. You see a plume of dust coming at you. As they approach you, you see the driver of this individual coming. It's a farm truck. And as the two drivers begin to meet each other, they raise one finger from the steering wheel. And it's not the one you're thinking of. It's actually an index finger. It's just a normal greeting of hi. Just, I don't know who you are, but I probably do, but I may not know you. And if you're on this road, you have to know where you are because no one else would possibly be here. So growing up in the Midwest, scenes like this sort of reminded me of what it was like to be in a rural community. When I was 4 years old, my parents separated, and my dad lived on a farm, and I visited him on the farm, and up until the 80s, until he lost the farm in the farm crisis. And my mom and I, we traveled around. She did various jobs and things. And I always knew that my parents loved me, but I sort of didn't agree with the rural life. It didn't really seem to fit me. And honestly, well, I didn't have a lot in common with my parents, even though I knew they cared about me. And then, when I turned 7, my father sat me down and said, "You're adopted." So I was trying to process this, like, how is this possible? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. Like, who are my parents, and where did I come from, and why did they leave me, and why are these things happening to me? It's not possible. Then I got some time from it, and I started thinking about it. It kind of made a bit of sense. Like, I didn't feel like I actually knew my parents as much as I probably should have. And so I decided to sort of take that and think about it. And when I was out and about, I would see people, and I would wonder if I'm related to them, because I hadn't seen anybody that looked like me. And so I'd see kids getting on and off the bus, and I would wonder if they were related to me. I'd be out in the public, and I'd see someone that I thought had a characteristic related to me, and I wondered if I was related to them. And that sort of happened for a while, but then as I got older and older, I thought about it less and less, knowing there was really no way to solve this problem. I just sort of left it. Then I went through school, and I was in high school, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I said I was going to go to college. I was going to go to community college. 2 years, I was going to be done. I was going to be a lab technician. It was going to be amazing. I went through the program. I didn't take the job. I decided I need 2 more years. That wasn't enough school for me, so I got 2 more years, and I'm going to learn everything. And I went to the advisor. You're going as a junior when you transfer, and you have to pick a major, of course. And so I was like, what major am I going to pick? I didn't know. I just liked a lot of stuff, but didn't really like any one thing. And so my temporary advisor was getting really annoyed with me and just, you need to pick something. So basically, in that time it was a book. You didn't look it up online. You flipped the book, and there were majors, and he was pointing his finger at a major and asked me about it. He got to genetics, and I was like, I remembered some genetics when I was taking microbiology course, and I remember some other things. I had Punnett squares, all those, like, you know what, let's pick it. I can always change my mind later. And of course, I didn't change my mind later. So after that 2 years, I was like, I'm going to be done and get a job. And I'm like, oh, no, that's not enough. I need more. So I ended up going to graduate school. So I went to graduate school, did the whole thing. And then fast forward to 2008, 10 years later, I'm doing my postdoc. I'm sitting in the cafeteria. I'm overhearing conversations that are all around me. And I overhear someone talking about a job. The job involved a lecture position, working in a lab, working with students, like in a lab course. And I thought, well, that sounds good. As a postdoc, I like working with students in the summer, and that was always a favorite time of mine. So as soon as I didn't actually talk to them much because I felt like if I was interested in the job, I didn't want to compete with them. So I just went back to my office, and I looked everything up and tried to figure out, okay, where is this? It turns out it was where I did my graduate work, which was actually here. And the position was available, and I did all the stuff. I applied, interviewed, all that stuff, and ended up getting the position. At that time, sort of direct-to-consumer testing was becoming a thing. So basically, you spit in the tube, you send it off, and they tell you about your genomic data. And that was around 2008, so Ancestry.com, 23andMe, those things were sort of coming up at the time, but weren't super popular, but were gaining traction. And students started asking me questions about these things. And I didn't really have all the right answers, clearly, and I didn't know the logistics of the answers. So I kind of just kept gathering feedback, and eventually I just took the plunge. So in 2018, I decided to submit my sample, and I thought, this will inform me on how to communicate with students, and so I did that. And I also didn't know my own ancestry, so I thought, well, let me give that a shot. All right, so then I sent it off. A month later, I got an email go check your data. So I checked the data, I go look at it. The first thing you can look at is your ancestry, basically where you came from. And it wasn't shocking to me. It was like British, Irish, German. Okay, nobody is surprised by that probably. And so that wasn't super informative. But then the other part of it was sort of this idea of DNA relatives. So other individuals in the database can allow them to share their data with you to see how similar you are. So I looked at that page, and it had thousands and thousands of individuals on. There was just a plethora of data, and it was just figuring out how to deal with it. But you could sort and sort of things. And so one of the things I sorted by similarity. And so it ranked all the people in there by similarity. And the top was 7%. And I thought, 7%, that's not really that big a deal. And I didn't really think about it. I was still processing all the stuff. And then a month later, Tom, the person that was actually at 7%, messaged me. And then I thought, wait a minute, I'm a geneticist. I should have thought 7% is a big deal. Like really, every generation it goes down by half, by half, by half. And actually the range of 7% is like first cousin once removed or second cousin. We're right in that range. And I should have thought about that. But I was just so occluded by all the data that I didn't really think about. Anyway, so Tom started messaging me. And we started going back and thinking about sort of or comparing our notes. And one of the things that we compared was where we grew up. So I grew up in Iowa. It turns out he grew up hour and a half from me. So then I was like, okay, things are happening. And so we talked a bit more, and basically he said, I think I know who your biological father is. So then I was trying to process this. Throughout the advent of Google and everything, I had done searches and tried to figure out how to find this information. I really didn't have any luck with it. And I never actually had to get to the point where I had to make a decision if I wanted to know or what I would do after I knew. It was just how could I get to the point of being able to know. And so it was sort of mind-blowing. And then I was thinking, well, wait a minute, would this person even want to know who I am? Would I bring up some compartmentalized trauma they had from a long time ago and I was going to make the situation worse? Do they think I wanted money from them? Like there are all these questions that are sort of driving me and thinking, what should I do? And so I asked Tom to be a third party. Basically, I'm interested in meeting this person. Could you talk to them to see if they're interested? And if we both agree, then we could set something up. So then Tom connected me with Don. So Don and I did the same sort of thing, and literally within a first few conversations, it did seem likely he was my biological father. But I wasn't satisfied, so I asked him to do the test. So he did the test, and in November of 2018, it came back, and yes, he was my biological father. So it turns out we don't have a super lot in common. He was raised on a horse farm, and he raised his horses. The one thing we did have in common is we have an interest in cars. And so I packed up my family in the summer, and we all sort of drove back to Iowa on a pilgrimage to meet this individual. And it turns out not only did I meet him, I met other individuals there. And I sat down at the table, and we're just sharing stories. And while sharing stories, I'm looking across the table, and I see someone that looks like me. That's something I hadn't had an experience except with my own children. So as my children grew up, that was the first time I saw someone that actually looked like me. And so that sort of made that connection. And so we communicate and we kept in touch. But clearly he enjoyed his life when he was young. And so he didn't really settle down until later in life. And so when I asked questions about my biological mother, there wasn't a lot of information that came from that conversation. But that sort of triggered my mind, like, if I'm going to find these people, I can't be passive about it. I got to do something. I need to be active about it. In the past, it was always just sort of a passive thing. If it happened, it happened. But I realized that if I waited much longer, I wasn't going to be able to find them. Either they could be dead already, or it might take me too long to find them, or they may not want to be found. That's another possibility. So when I was in college at that time, my mother gave me my adoption papers. And on my adoption papers, it said, and it was supposed to be a closed adoption, but in the 70s it didn't really happen that way. And so when they described me in the adoption papers, it said baby Cotenbutel. And that was a weird name. And I sort of assumed that was my bio mother's last name, but I didn't really know for sure. And the nurse told my mother, when I say mother, my adoptive mother, told my mother that my bio mom had a derivative of Chris as her name, and I don't think my mom actually remembered what the real name was. So they named me Christopher because it was an homage to that. So I had a partial first name, and I had what I thought was a last name. And the advent of search engines, and actually I use Ask Jeeves if you're old enough to remember that, I tried all these things, and I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything. And so I kind of felt a little disheartened. Then I dug back into that 23andMe data and those thousands of individuals. And when I did that, I had to scroll a long ways. And eventually I did find Coton-Beetle in there. Less than 1% match, but I saw it. It was there, so I knew there was some potential. So then I had to figure out, how am I going to go forward with this? I tried contacting that person. That didn't help at all. And so I ended up going on social media, and I found these sites that help find lost people. And so I tracked these sites, and I followed them, and I did that for several months. And as I saw them, there were all these great stories about finding lost people, but there was a lot of tragic stories where they found them and they didn't want anything to do with them, or they found them and they were lost already. And so I sort of had to weigh those things. And then I told you I was interested in understanding 23andMe so I could communicate with my students. So after I found my biofather, I gave a lecture on 23andMe. And now it was coming up to do the next one. And as I was coming up to the next one the night before, it was all in my mind. I'm like, I'm going to do it. I put all my data on this social media page. A volunteer picks it up. And so the next day I'm going to have to do the lecture. So I go in the next day, and I'm getting ready to go to work. I'm checking my messages, and I get a message. I think I found your biological mother. It was shocking, honestly. It turns out her name is Christy. So it was a derivative of Chris. I just didn't know what it really was. And then the information came flying in. Like, I had a picture of her. I knew where she lived, only 4 hours from here. I knew what car she drove. I knew what her car looked like. All these things started coming, and it was really because the connection was this individual had access to an obituary database. So you can imagine females are often difficult to locate because they don't have their maiden name anymore. Many of them changed their name. So I had as a derivative of the first name and a maiden name, and it's rare to find those two things together, especially for an older person. And so what turns out when there's an obituary, it turns out her father had passed away. So her father had her maiden name, and the next of kin was in there, and that was where her first name was. And so we had that information to put it together. I just didn't have access to that information. All right, so we had all this, and then what I was not expecting at all, that I had two siblings that I didn't know anything about. And within minutes, I had their social media profiles in front of me. I knew what they looked like. I knew what their spouse was. I knew what their kids looked like, all at the same time. And it was about 10 minutes before I had to run to class, and I was still processing all this, and it was actually kind of an emotional time, to be honest. So I was like, all right, I got to put all this away, and I ran to class, and I got there, and I did my 23andMe lecture, and I was still deciding in mind if I was going to mention anything about it, and I decided to mention it. So at the end, I told my story of all these things that I just learned just literally an hour before. And when I was all done, they applauded, and it was a great experience. But I still hadn't found her, and actually I didn't even know if she was alive yet, so how was I going to do that? So fortunately, I tried the social media route. She had a social media page, but she didn't use it, which is fine. I had her address, so I used the address. I took a week to craft the letter and figuring out, okay, how am I going to write this? I didn't share it with anybody. I sent it away, regular mail. I didn't do anything fancy, just sent it off, and I waited for days and days. It seemed like forever, but it really wasn't that long. And then on a Saturday morning, I got a text message, and it was her. And we text back and forth for about 2 hours. And then after that, a few days later, we coordinated a time for her to come meet me. She was only 4 hours away. So a month passed, a car pulls in the driveway. It parked in the driveway for what seemed like for absolutely ever. And I waited and I waited. I had no idea what I was going to do. Nothing prepared me to figure out how I was going to greet this person. What was I going to say? Like, I had no idea. And she got out of the car, and she started walking up the sidewalk, and I was sort of walking down to meet her at the front door. And the only thing I could think of was just to say hi. I had remembered that growing up as a kid. That was a universal thing you did. It didn't matter if you knew them or not. You just said hi. Hi was not enough for her. She had waited 43 years to see me, and she wanted to hug. So we hugged, and then we went back, and we just talked for a couple of hours, shared our stories, shared pictures, and all these sorts of things. And she told me about the hard decisions she had to make to give me up. She told me about the siblings that I had and how they knew I existed. She also told me about how my birthday was sort of a somber time for reflection for her for every year. And so we learned about these sorts of things. And so at that time, I just sort of felt this, like, science really connected me in a way that I had never been connected before. It allowed me to answer something that I never thought I was going to answer before. And not only that, when I share my story with students, I share it in a way that they can connect sort of, advanced science and technology to some of a personal part of it. And since I've done that, I've had other students come up to me and say they're on a similar journey. And that journey asked me for my advice of how to help them. And so I sort of feel like a difficult decision that a woman, a new mother, made decades ago sort of is paid forward to the point now I can help other people find their origin story. Thank you.